Good evening and welcome to Island View on Eastlink Community TV. Glad you could join us for our first show of the new year 2019, and we thought we'd begin the new year by taking a look back at the year in politics on PEI, and who better to join us to do this than the Premier of PEI, Wade MacLauchlan. It's my pleasure to welcome the Premier back to the program. Wade, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here, Matt.
Time is short and lots to talk about, so we'll jump right into it. And I guess the first place to begin, most recent sitting of the legislature, the fall sitting of the legislature. If you blinked, you might have missed it. Pretty short, just under a month, a little over 3.5 weeks long. I guess my first question, why such a short sitting? Last year you went almost to Christmas.
That's not out of the order for the fall sitting, Matt. What it was really significant about the fall sitting is the amount of work we got done. 27 bills, capital budgets, supplementary estimates, a couple of major appointments, a lot of collaboration, and in the space of, as you said, 14 working days. I went shortly after, well, in fact, immediately after those meetings to the First Minister's meetings in Montreal. And I was telling some of my colleagues there, they could hardly believe it. They could go years and not get 27 bills passed. So I was pleased with what we got done.
You mentioned the cooperation on legislation. We saw some private members' bills passed. The first one from the Green Party, some bills brought forward by the Conservative Party. So we have some bipartisan legislation. Maybe some other legislatures around the country could take their heed from PEI. Often when you turn on the proceedings, we have it on every day here at Eastlink, and we like to tune in to see what's happening and watch the discourse. Sometimes it can be rancorous, and that's the nature of the debate. But the fact that you guys were able to maybe put aside whatever differences you have on some issues and pass some much needed legislation around things like mental health and sexual assault training for judges, how important was that?
Oh, by all means, Matt, and in a number of those cases, there was real kind of sleeves rolled up collaborative work done behind the scenes or up and down the stairs among the parties to ensure that we got to something that was a good balance in terms of the position. And you're quite right to point to the sexual assault policies, for example, the work on education for judges, the work on autism was a good example of how we actually sort of went together and came up with something that many people see as an achievement for Islanders and for children and for families.
If you watch, sometimes you might think that the members of the Liberal Party and the opposition, when you walked out those doors, that maybe things would dissolve sometimes into a shouting match. But behind closed doors, I'm sure there has to be some relationships and there has to be some mutual respect for everybody in the House. How much of what we see on TV is maybe sometimes for TV's sake, and how much of what happens behind the doors are real relationship building in terms of getting things done?
There's a lot of theater. That's the nature of politics, and in particular for those who watch Question Period, that's its nature, and it's set up in those very tight time segments and point counterpoint that people enjoy for the dramatic part of it, I'll call it. Mm-hmm. But then when you get down to what's involved in getting a budget passed, what's involved in getting legislation through, of course it's for a stable majority government to take the lead, and in fact that what happened in the most recent sitting. We went in there with an agenda. We were well prepared, and we anticipated some of the pieces that would come from the opposition and work together on those. So of course there have to be relationships that are clear, where you work together, and it can happen right there on the floor too. That's why you have to have House leaders who work together, and there's some give and take.
Right after the sitting ended, as usually is the case, the latest political poll came out, CRA poll, released on December 11th. The Green Party continues to lead in overall popularity at 37%, down 1% from the previous poll. The Liberal Party sits at 36, up a point from 35, and the PC Party continued steady at 20%. What do those polls say to you, or what is that particular finding?
I think they tell us that we're in a democracy and that there'll be an election someday and that Islanders will be asked to choose a government to continue leading the province. There are there are really two questions that I look at, Matt, that are not what I'll call hypothetical. That's to say, most of the numbers that you've just cited are what the social kind of people measuring these things, social scientists would call a forced choice. What if? There are two questions. One is, what is your current view in terms of satisfaction with the government or with the direction of the province? 57% of Islanders this time said that they were satisfied, as opposed to some number in the 30s who weren't, and that's on a 5-point scale. The other is, and there's actually a question that is buried in the CRA poll that comes out a little later, and it's they ask in the 4 provinces, the respondents, what is your view of the strategic direction of the province? Is the province headed in the right strategic direction, yes or no? In August, 71% of Islanders said yes to that. In the other 3 provinces, it's around 50%. To me, that tells us what I need to know in terms of what we're currently doing in governing the province and providing programs and investing in Islanders and with the resources of the province, and that's what we're here to do as a government.
Last minute, so last question in this segment. In terms of, oh, I hear the music, so I'll hold off on that question till the second segment. Stay with us. You're watching our first show of 2019 as we look back at the year in politics with the Premier of PEI, Wade MacLauchlan. Stay with us. You're watching Island View on Eastlink Community TV. Welcome back to Island View on Eastlink Community TV. I'm Matt Beardsley. Glad you could join us tonight for our first show of 2019 as we continue our discussion with the Premier of PEI, Wade MacLauchlan. We're just talking the latest CRA poll that came out on December 11th. The other thing they always like to talk about, they do a popularity poll in terms of the leaders, and Peter Bevan-Baker remains the most popular of the 4 leaders at 37%. You are at second at 24%. How much do you worry about that? Again, what do you sort of think of that result?
The day I'm interested in is election day. And I say, whether it's today or election day, my greatest concern is that Islanders are doing well. And I say if Islanders are doing well, then I think they'll likely be satisfied that they've got the Premier they want.
All right, we'll move on to everybody's favorite program, the provincial nominee program, which continues to be in the news and was much in the news in 2018 for a number of different reasons. In September, your government made the decision to close the entrepreneur stream of the PEMP program, citing low retention rates. For those who aren't familiar with their program, and there may be some, it allowed immigrants to gain permanent residency after paying a $200,000 deposit as long as they had established a business. The other big news around this program, there was an investigation by Canadian border service agencies into 2 alleged immigration fraud rings, the most noticeable at the Sherwood Motel. There was a trial. The trial has been stayed as of we're talking right now, so there has been no conviction in that trial. The optics seem to be that the program was shut down shortly. This investigation was ongoing. There was a lot of news around this, and the two seem to go hand in hand. Your government had conducted an investigation of the program. We're taking a look at it. Is it right to connect the dots and say that you closed the program because of the bad news that continues to surround it?
There's absolutely no connection, Matt. Your reference to the Sherwood Motel and the Border Services investigation there, from the time I first heard about that, I said that I'd be very surprised if there's a conviction in this, and frankly, I think it was badly handled from the federal side from the beginning, and that's why it was stayed. In terms of the program itself, and let's be clear about this part. Today, 85% of the people who come to Prince Edward Island as international migrants come for employment purposes and come for a specific job, for a specific employer, and we're in an entirely different world in terms of the retention, the attachment to community, the settlement prospects, and the commitment to be here in Prince Edward Island and do well. This is really the 2018 story about where we are on immigration. If you go back in history to the early 1990s, when the investor stream was first opened, we've been continuously reviewing that, and certainly since I've been Premier, we've reviewed it a number of times on a continuing basis, made some changes last year in 2017, and this year decided to change, you can say close. What we decided to do is give a 2-year window for those investors to come on a work permit as opposed to what was called the escrow arrangement. But we still have investor immigrants coming, about 15% of our total immigration streams, plural, because there are a number of programs under which people can come. And when you look at where Prince Edward Island is, and this is really where Prince Edward Islanders need to be proud as opposed to fearful about where this is all going, Prince Edward Island is actually leading in Atlantic Canada and has for a couple of decades in terms of what we've done and how we've proceeded, and with the scale and the success and the effectiveness and the impact of our immigration programs, and we're making those better all the time.
The other big talking point around the stream that was closed was the money that went into general revenue for the government when these immigrants defaulted. There were 177 in the 2016-17 year, which totaled $27 million. 18 million of that was from immigrants who defaulted on their deposits. Again, the low retention rates, the failure to end this money, you just sort of basically answered my question. That it didn't really affect the decision, or?
Let's repeat that these are people who entered that stream 4 to 7 years ago, before you get to the default point. So we are not today dealing with defaults on anything close to that scale. From the point of view of the revenue, that was the whole basis on which people vouched for their intentions to come, to be here as investors. And many people, as I'm sure you know, and islanders who are following the development of our economy know, many people have come as investor immigrants and have invested in successful island businesses. This has been a very big part of how our economy has done, really, over the past decade. Prince Edward Island's the only province in Canada that went through that decade, including the 2008 to 10 downturn, without having a year of recession. So this is all part of how we've proceeded. As far as the fiscal side of it, I think it's well known that we've got the province's finances in pretty good shape. Anything I've ever been involved with, I say you have to keep the revenue line above the expenditure line. And as you know, in 2017-18, we closed the year with a $75 million surplus. So we've got a lot of ways in which our province is doing well, and which our finances are in good shape. And what we've done historically with our immigration programs is not a necessary part of continuing to keep things balanced for the province going forward.
At some point in time, we'll close the book on that program, and we'll look back on it. What do you think the lessons are to be learned? As you mentioned, there was some good, there was some bad, there was some stuff in the middle. What do you think will be the lessons we'll look back and learn about this program in its entirety?
Matt, I'd say the number one lesson is that Prince Edward Island has been well served by the fact that governments in earlier days decided to step forward in terms of attracting international immigrants to be part of our positive future for our province. And everybody who comes, I've talked to islanders who moved away from here 30, 40 years ago, and they'll come back and say, well, this is a different Prince Edward Island than when I left. So I think that's very important, culturally, socially, even in terms of the variety of cuisine that's available, and in investing in our businesses. But where we are today, under the Atlantic Growth Strategy, the federal government opened up a further stream called the Immigration Pilot, or the Atlantic Pilot Program, and allocated 2,000 places by province according to our population. Prince Edward Island, more than 150 businesses stepped forward. Prince Edward Island filled its allocation way ahead of the other provinces, and in fact, there's been some additional spaces opened up because people are coming to Prince Edward Island, are doing well, are settling in all parts of the province. We saw something recently where the O'Leary Curling Club was putting on curling lessons for a significant number of people who were living in that area. So this is how our province is evolving, and frankly, I think it's something that people can see in all of our communities and in our society and in our economy, and it's actually to the benefit of the province.
We're in our last minute, so I'm not going to get into our next subject. We'll save that for the third segment, so we'll break a little bit early here before we get into the topic that dominated the news in 2018, affordable housing. Stay with us. You're watching the first show of 2019 of Island View on Eastlink Community TV. We'll be right back and continue our conversation with the Premier of PEI, Wade MacLauchlan. Thanks for joining us tonight. Welcome back to Island View on Eastlink Community TV. I'm Matt Beardsley. Glad you could join us tonight for our first show of the new year 2019 as we continue our discussion with the Premier of PEI, Wade MacLauchlan, looking back on the news and politics of 2018. There's no question that the #1 news topic in 2018 and continues to be news was the issue around affordable housing on PEI, particularly in the major centres, Summerside and Charlottetown. As we tape this interview, the vacancy rate right now in Charlottetown is at 0.3%. It was 1.2 at the same time in 2017. For 3 or more bedroom properties, the vacancy rate is 0. The average rent for 2-bedroom apartments is now up from $852 to $903. And we have seen from 2016 in Charlottetown, the vacancy rate at 1.7, as I mentioned, now down to almost 0 as we speak. When did you sort of first become aware that maybe, I don't want to say we have an issue, but this is becoming a concern for a lot of residents?
I think, Matt, if you go back and replay our interview from this time last year, I said that the two issues for 2018 would be housing and workforce, and they go together. So over the past 2 years, we've created 7,000 new full-time jobs in our province. That's putting the kind of pressure that you're talking about and that we know about in terms of the matching up the demand and the supply of housing. So it's a supply issue, and it's one that definitely requires leadership and commitment and resources from the province. It requires activity in the private sector. It requires participation of other levels of government and also the not-for-profit sector. And that's all happening right now in a very dynamic way, and I'm proud to say that that's the case. It takes a while, of course, in housing.
You released your housing action plan recently, committing to 1,000 new units over 4 years, 175 in the next fiscal year. One of the things you announced was 100 new units in Charlottetown and 75 in surrounding communities. The latest information I have, I think, as of November, was that RFPs had gone out for this development. Where do we stand right now on this?
Oh, you can see some of it actually taking place on coming in the St. Peter's Road on the right-hand side. There's some seniors housing that's under construction there. You'll see, in fact, I encourage Islanders to stay tuned on this. Over the next weeks, there are a number of pieces that are already well in hand in terms of commitments, different parties involved to actually respond on the affordable housing side. And here's the piece that is perhaps not seen so much, but it's a great example of how government can do things and actually go to where people are. Back in the spring, when we unveiled this in our budget and then in our housing action plan, we had 275 what are called rent sups or rent supplements for people who qualify according to certain criteria. Today we have 609. That's to say we've more than doubled, in fact increased by about 120%. the number of people in Prince Edward Island who stay where they're living, but get the rent supplement. So this is a multifaceted initiative. It requires some construction, it requires some financing, it requires some changes, for example, in municipal bylaws, and it's something where a lot of different players are involved. And I'd say with real clarity on this, that there's more going on, and there's more going on in terms of government policy and resources in affordable housing in Prince Edward Island, or social housing in Prince Edward Island today, than has been the case since the 1980s.
One of the topics that comes up a lot when talked about this is the Airbnb phenomenon, where people, short-term vacation rentals, some properties now will rent sort of spring to summer and then rent over the summer in the effort to make more money, and people have every right to do that by all means. One of the things you also announced in terms of the Housing Action program was to take a scan of short-term vacation rentals to see their impact on the housing market, what other jurisdictions had taken in to manage their impact. When will we see some news on that front from the government's point of view?
There's a very active review going on to see what we can learn in terms of best practices from other jurisdictions. And it reminds me, when you asked this question, Matt, that in the spring of last year in the legislature, we had a motion on the floor about housing, and I mentioned the vacation rentals as one of the challenges on the supply side. And the opposition openly scoffed at me and even went to town on social media saying, well, that just showed how out of touch I was. So this is something that's come on very quickly in terms of its scale. It is a factor in terms of the available supply of housing. It's also a factor in terms of responding to the growth in tourism in the province. So it's one of those cases where government can't just kind of wake up on a Friday morning and say, we're going to flip the switch from here to here, and this will be the new reality. You have to take a real measure of what the impact can be in a number of different sectors, and make sure that what we do helps the situation.
Another thing you talked about was working together with municipalities who are responsible for zoning and regulations to better support housing development and capacity in all regions of the island. We've seen some issues between developers and City Council here in Charlottetown in terms of getting things approved, and some bylaws around parking, things of that nature. What kind of conversations are you having with the municipalities to maybe, I can't say push them in the right direction, but maybe, discussions about how you might be better able to support them in changing some of their regulations?
It can be regulation. It could also be how municipalities can contribute in terms of, for example, tax approach, and perhaps even a tax holiday for developers who want to put in place social or affordable housing. So there are currently initiatives, and it's all in the public space, and it will become more so, from West Prince to Three Rivers, where councils are looking actively at projects that will make a difference in terms of supply, that will make a difference in terms of affordability, and that are going to allow their communities to grow in a dynamic way, because it's our population that's growing, and growing in all parts of the province, that's really behind this.
Last question for this particular show. We'll have part 2 next week. There seems to be a demand, obviously, looking at it from 10,000 feet, okay, we need construction, we need skilled workers. There seems to be a gap there. Obviously, not everybody wants to move into that industry, but perhaps what is the government doing to support a young man or young woman who might want to take advantage of this boom right now in all the areas surrounding this sort of issue?
And let me link your question to the previous discussion about affordable housing, because on the private economy side, or the private sector side of residential construction, we have an absolute boom. It's about 100% increase over the last 2 years in terms of the annual activity. So there is absolutely a need for skilled workers, for laborers, for people to do all kinds of jobs. We've seen an increase of somewhere in the order of 800 to 1,000 people who are in construction, who are actively working. We have programs that, together with the Construction Association, to encourage young people. We have programs with the Women's Network to get more women into the trades through program called Trade Horizons. We've got various programs, including transportation. We've got childcare, and actually childcare is one of the issues in terms of people getting to the workforce. And you know, and maybe Matt, I just don't want to take too much of your time.
Yeah, I need to wrap up.
I have to finish. We have the highest labour participation rate in Prince Edward Island, east of Manitoba, and that's something that we're very proud of.
All right, we'll continue our conversation with the Premier of PEI, Wade MacLauchlan, next week, and we'll take a look ahead to what might be in store for politics in 2019. For the rest of the crew, I'm Matt Beardsley. Thanks for watching Island View on Eastlink Community TV. We'll see you next Tuesday at 7 o'clock. Good evening and welcome to Island View on Eastlink Community TV. I'm Matt Beardsley. Glad you could join us tonight for part 2 of our first of the year interview with the Premier of PEI, Wade MacLauchlan, as we take a look ahead to what might be unfolding in 2019. Premier, again, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here, Matt.
For those who follow or on social media, as I am, following all the major political parties, we're seeing nominations being held for candidates in all sorts of districts. You were elected on May the 4th, 2015. It's widely suspected that there will be a provincial election in 2019. So I guess my first question is, will Islanders be going to the polls in 2019?
You know, Matt, if you look at PEI history, we've had 39 elections, and they've generally, well, on average, gone on every 41 months. So maybe we should have had an election in October, according to that, math. But the people keep talking about an election. I think the opposition more or less called one twice in 2018, and it's one of those things that will happen when it's time. There's a course here that could go out as far as 2020, but as you say, it'll be 4 years in the spring.
So that's a maybe?
I guess my mother has the best advice on this. She says if we keep talking about it, we'll eventually be right. Or my brother said to me recently, today we're a day closer to it than we were yesterday.
I guess the next question is, if and when Islanders go to the polls, will you be the leader of the Liberal Party at that time?
Yes, and happy to be. I'm very happy doing my job as Premier, and I'm happy to be leading the Liberal Party.
There's also speculation that there will be a federal election in 2019 as well. Of course, you know, as you said, we can't see the tea leaves ahead in the coming months. There's always that people talk about, you know, sometimes election fatigue. How might what the federal Liberal Party does affect the provincial Liberal Party here in terms of calling an election?
So there is a federal law that has the election date set for, I think it's October 21st, and the Prime Minister has confirmed that he doesn't have any other plans, so I think that's pretty clear. As far as the fatigue part, Islanders love to take part in elections. I was really proud in 2018 of the active part that Islanders played, the number of people who came forward in municipal elections, very successful. And our voter participation rates in provincial elections have been in the mid 80% range, and I expect that'll be the case, and be more likely to be enthusiastic than fatigued.
If and when we have our next provincial election, the Liberal Party in PEI will be seeking a fourth straight mandate. Something that's not often been done. I did a little research yesterday. I was able to go back and see it was done twice let's say, since 1920 on. 1935 to 1955, Walter M. Lee led the party, and in 35, and your good friend Alex Campbell led the Liberals from 1966 to 1978. What do you think will be the biggest issue confronting the Liberal Party as it tries to seek a four-straight mandate if and when we have our next election?
I think the question is always for Islanders to take stock of how they're doing and what confidence they have in the current government to continue governing. And that's what I expect will be on their minds. And when I look at where we are in terms of the province's progress, unemployment rate lower than it's ever been, books balanced, economy growing, 7,000 new full-time jobs in 2 years. That's all got to enter into it, as well as the initiatives and programs and investments that we're making as a government. That's what Islanders will have in mind.
We talked about the most recent poll on last week that came out that had the Green Party as the most popular political party right now. Now, again, there was 32% were undecided in that poll. That's a sizable percentage. If all that percentage decided to vote any one particular way, they could, sway the election. But we sometimes hear now in the public discourse that people are tired of politics as usual. And people always say this, governments get voted out. They don't necessarily vote a government in sometime because people just want to change for change's sake sometime. We hear that, talking point, tired government, that sort of thing. I guess my question would be, what are you guys doing to appear to not be doing politics as usual and to be trying to offer, I don't want to say something different, but appeal to people who may think, they've had a good run, it's time for somebody else?
So one is, of course, we're doing government. So we've had 4 years in government, very prosperous time, a lot of new initiatives, stepping into areas that frankly haven't been looked at for 30 or 40 years, whether you're looking at municipal government or water or policing or education or the work that's being done in various areas throughout the province for the economy to do as well as it is, our work in poverty reduction, our work in housing, our work in fact to change the whole scale and orientation of support for Islanders who are the most vulnerable. One of the things that people are quite paying attention to and believe is a priority is the investments that we're making in both programs and in institutional capacity to deal with mental health. So Matt, I think that's really where Islanders will actually be turning their attention as it comes time for an election, and where frankly I believe they have their attention today, and I'm happy to lead a government that's been addressing these issues and that has the capacity and that is doing it in a way that shows good stewardship and an ability to have sustainable growth.
1 minute, last question in this segment. A new year is always a good time to look back at the previous year and sort of reflect. We often say failure is the greatest teacher. When you look back on the past year, was there a file, a topic, an issue, you sit around the cabinet table and said, yeah, we maybe could have done a little better there?
There's always something, Matt, and I'll give you a very precise example. I mean, I was asked when they were closing the O'Leary potato plant, the packaging plant, not closing it actually, they're repurposing it. So what's my reaction to that? That was the very day that we were developing a program to encourage Islanders to come home. And the question was asked, do you think Islanders will come home if they're having that, losing those jobs in O'Leary? And I said, our economy is growing, we've got new jobs and everything. So people took me to be saying, well, I don't care about that. So you go back over the year, and Alex Campbell said to me, the best speech you give is the one on the way home. So there's always something where you could go back and give it something with a different context or a different tone, and that's one thing I would change in 2018.
All right, we'll continue our discussion with the Premier of PEI, Wade MacLauchlan, as we look ahead to the year 2019. Stay with us. You're watching Island View on Eastlink Community TV. Welcome back to Island View on Eastlink Community TV. I'm Matt Beardsley. Glad you could join us tonight as we continue our discussion with the Premier of PEI, Wade MacLauchlan, as we look ahead to 2019. When you took office on May the 4th, 2015, you said one of your goals was to get the population of PEI up over 150,000. Did a little looking, and when you came into office, the population of PEI was 144,259. Today it's 153,244. That's an increase of 8,985 people, which is, when you look at it, you know, the better part of the population of Stratford or Cornwall. That's quite a sizable growth, and we've referenced in our chat last week about how that has driven demand on housing in some of the sectors. When I phrase this question, I want to be careful. Is this kind of growth sustainable, or we've seen some of the strains it has put? Now, it's sort of the chicken and the egg. It creates some problems, but it also creates opportunities. Where do we go in terms of attracting people and sustaining them?
We have a long-term population action plan that says we'll have 160,000 people by 2022. We're well on track for that, and it is sustainable, and in fact, we wouldn't have the kind of prosperity and the kind of diversity and activity that we have in the province without it. So this is exactly what we've foresaw, Matt, and frankly, it's good for Prince Edward Island, and I envisage it continuing once we get to 160,000, that Prince Edward Island has ways in which we can see ourselves continue to grow, and we're responding to that, the housing being one example, jobs being another. You mentioned that we have 8,000 some new citizens in this time. Some of them are babies, but we've got 7,000 new full-time jobs in the past 2 years. So that's what comes with growth, and frankly, one leads to the other, and you don't have to look too far. You can look across the strait to see provinces that are suffering from not having that kind of population growth.
I know one of the talking points has been about new Canadians just settling in the urban centres, you know, Charlottetown, the Cornwall, Stratford area, some in Summerside, and some of our smaller communities are having difficulty retaining their youth. My generation are having less children than my parents' generation, so we've seen it in some of the issues around schooling and some of this family of schools where the declining enrollment, because there's just as not many children. I know one of the things you started last year was to try and attract new immigrants and match them up with job opportunities that existed in rural communities. What are you guys continuing to try and do to make the whole island an attractive place to live and not just have everybody settle into the city centres?
Well, I would say, Matt, Prince Edward Island today is an example, a model to other jurisdictions in terms of how, in fact, you can have population growth, economic growth, job growth in rural and urban Prince Edward Island, and have people living. I can take you to St. Peter's, I can take you to Tignish, I can take you to Three Rivers or to O'Leary, and you'll have people in all of those communities, as well as in Summerside and Charlottetown and North Rustico, that are new to the community, that are settling, that are contributing into community organizations, that are working, that are growing families. And that, in fact, is what we envisaged and what we want to continue to support. And in turn, those communities and the community organizations in those areas are also working very actively to support that. So we're going to continue on a sustainable basis with the pattern that Islanders can see.
And there's no question that the demographics of PEI has changed, particularly in Charlottetown and surrounding area, and to some degree in Summerside as well. A good friend of mine coaches the university men's basketball team at UPEI. We went to school together in the late 80s, early 90s, and when he came with his family to PEI end of last summer to take over the job, he said, I can't believe the changes. He's African Canadian, so back in the 90s when we went out, he was largely the only black person in every room he walked into. That's certainly not the case when you walk around Charlottetown or go around now. With that, we were seeing, as we talked about, the faces of PEI changing and the faces in Charlottetown. We're seeing cultures bump up against each other. We're seeing people working with new faces. I don't want to get into the larger discussion of nationalism and globalism and some of the issues that other countries are having, but this presents opportunities. It also presents some challenges. How does PEI move forward to make sure that everybody who comes to PEI feels like they're welcomed and that they're also respecting and taking part in the traditions that have made PEI the place it is today?
It's a great question, Matt, and I like to say Prince Edward Island is a place you can get your arms around, and it is. And you can see it. You can go to our communities. There are active community organizations. They include each other. They support each other. The people, neighbors have each other's back, and communities are growing and thriving in that way. And we can be proud of that because, frankly, you can look around the globe and find that it doesn't take much to, or, you know, you can easily point to tension. But what we have in Prince Edward Island, and what we also have, and it's really important what's taking place right now, we have a lot of Prince Edward Islanders who started out, grew up here, went to school here, went away for a decade and so on. Our largest growth in terms of our total population is in the 25 to 39-year-olds. And that's people, in many cases, who are moving back, and they're in Muscush, and they're in Surrey, they're in Alberton, and they're having families, and they're getting involved in the community. And that exactly is what Prince Edward Islanders can see, or maybe can't see, in terms of our overall growth and development.
How active is the government in terms of speaking to the youth that are staying, the youth that are coming back, and also speaking to new Canadians? Maybe they've been here for a year, 2 years. What's your experience been like? What roadblocks have you faced? Obviously employment, and most specifically sometimes language is an issue in terms of adapting to a culture. Not everybody's going to stay. Lots of Islanders leave because they don't like it here. Lots stay, lots come home. Yeah. What is the government trying to do to, track this and continue this discussion with new immigrants, so maybe we can do a better job there or something like that?
So this is a continuous relationship. This discussion is going on, and not just with government. It's in church groups, it's in settlement groups, in various communities. It's employment, and that's one of the things that I'm really proud of in terms of where we've come with people who are coming new to the province. As I said, 85% of them are coming for a specific job with a specific employer who in many cases is making a commitment in terms of the overall settlement of those people. And that's where I think you really get the long-term success of our communities and of our economy and of our businesses, is to grow our population with that full embrace.
All right, before we get into the next segment, we'll pause here for a quick break. Stay with us. You're watching Island View on Eastlink Community TV as we continue our discussion with the Premier of PEI, Wade MacLauchlan, about the year ahead in politics 2019. Welcome back to Island View on Eastlink Community TV. I'm Matt Beardsley. Thanks for joining us tonight as we continue our discussion with the Premier of PEI, Wade MacLauchlan, about the year ahead in 2019. You've referenced the economy on PEI, and by all indicators here, retail trade up, wholesale trade up, manufacturing sales up, GDP up. Now I'm going to point to one area that I found was down, not to be negative Nelly here, looking at farm receipts and farm incomes. In 2013, they reached a high of $62.5 million. They've been on a steady decline each year since then to $34.7 million in 2017, which is down almost $9 million from the previous year. What do we make of that decline in one of the staple industries on PEI?
The weather. So we had 20 sectors in the economy. The two that didn't quite achieve in 2017 what they did in the previous year had to do with farm income and very precisely dry summers. In 2018, we had an even crazier year, or an even more chaotic year, you might say, in terms of the weather. Wet June, wet fall, and a hot, dry summer. So this is something that actually is of concern. What we are seeing, and I think it's really important to make that linkage, is that those are the farm gate receipts. In terms of the overall economy, or the value, because of the processing and manufacturing related to food in Prince Edward Island. That's where a lot of the growth in manufacturing is coming, is further up the value chain in food. So we can still continue to call ourselves Canada's food island, and we can make sure that the farmers are getting good value for what they're putting into it, and that overall we're building that reputation and that economy.
One of the things you also spoke about when you came into office just a little under 4 years ago was trade balance. You wanted to, see that get better. This past year we had a deficit for the first time after 3 years of surplus. If I read the numbers right, you'll correct me if I didn't. What do we make of what happened last year in terms of goods coming out and goods coming in?
What we've actually done is continue to close that gap. That's to say, we're buying more of our own goods, we're spending more money locally. So that's really what it comes down to, is how you can gain more from your exports and from your local consumption, and then buy less goods from outside the province. And in fact, Prince Edward Island has been doing a really good job of it, and that's where a lot of the prosperity that we're seeing is coming from. It's that we're doing business with each other. We've got a lot of really neat small businesses that are starting up across the board. They might be in retail, they might be in food, they might be in the cultural sector. Service sector is growing, and we actually have the strongest record after Kitchener-Waterloo for startup businesses in our province, and I'm so proud of that. And this is the kind of thing that a government wants to see continue, and frankly is the basis for our, I might say, sustainable prosperity.
Governments all around the world like to say that small business is the engine of economy, and unfortunately, the end of 2018, we saw a much larger business, DME, go into receivership on PEI, which became a talking point in the legislature. I don't want to get into the merits of what happened within that particular company, hoping as we're speaking, the time this goes to air, something may have been changed or resolved to allow that company to stay into business. But it gets into the question of what role does government play in intervening or supporting larger businesses. I don't want to say too big to fail, but obviously I'm sure when you receive the news, you're dismayed. You never want to see a company that deals internationally, or even if it's the business across the street, go out of business. But what role does government play in trying to support, sustain, assist any business, but particularly larger, more noticeable businesses when they fall into some difficult times?
So government's first concern is to ensure that a talented workforce, and there's very much talented people at that particular enterprise and throughout the manufacturing sector, continue to find opportunities in the province. And Matt, these numbers came out just at the end of December, where Canada's manufacturing grew by 8%. Prince Edward Island's manufacturing in that same 8-month period grew, a 12-month period, grew by almost 40%.
38.8%.
Thank you. Good for you. You're doing it. So Matt, that reflects a lot of people employed. 1,200 new jobs in manufacturing alone in the period that we're talking about. So government, first of all, make sure that the workers and their families and their livelihood is well looked after, that people have an opportunity to get started. Second, and to grow, actually, the workforce. Second, government can play a very important role as a lender to ensure that where there is a good enterprise, that they have the capacity to put the resources toward the growth of the business, or if something goes wrong, that it may get a rebound. So that's our main business as government. I'm proud to say that in the 4 years we've been in government, we haven't had any of those situations where government's putting money down into a bad situation or trying to bail out of something that we shouldn't have been in the first place. We've had an even hand, a positive environment. We've actually given tax relief across the board to small businesses, as you know, twice now. And that's where we think the government's approach is to support, take a light hand, make sure the environment is positive, support sales and growth, and then let the businesses do the work from there.
There's always that saying that government takes too much blame when things go bad, and maybe they don't get enough credit when things go right. I'm sure the actual line falls somewhere in the middle. We referenced in our previous program those recent poll numbers. As I go through the numbers, and I'm not trying to be a shill for the Liberal Party, but there are a lot of positive things happening in the province economically. Why doesn't that translate into perhaps, I mean, you referenced the satisfaction number there. Of course, that was close to 60%, so sometimes the two things are sort of separate. Does that I don't want to say disconnect, but sometimes what appears to be maybe the two not lining up. Does that concern you, or?
People will eventually come to the point, and they'll come to the point on election day when they decide how things are going and how they want them to continue going, and that's my view. And not just on the economy, what's happening in health, what's happening in social programs, what we're doing with the environment, what we're doing to meet our carbon reduction commitments, and I would say that our record across the board of good stewardship, good leadership, that Islanders are doing well, and that our province can be proud that we're showing leadership on key issues. That, to my mind, is what I want Islanders to take account of, and I'm proud to be part of it.
Last question for this segment. In terms of business, I know you travel around the island a lot when the house isn't in, and I see your social media posts where you're dropping into here and there. You give me lots of good ideas for guests for Island View. When you talk to people who are starting businesses or working in the business community, whether it be big, small, or whatever, what are they saying to you? What are those discussions about? What concerns them? What they're happy about? Those sorts of things.
Their number one concern is workforce. Their number two concern is just their ability to keep up with their growth opportunities. All things considered, that's a pretty good spot to be in for people starting a business in Prince Edward Island, or growing a business in Prince Edward Island today, and I'm proud to be part of a government that's keeping up with that growth.
Premier, you're very busy. I appreciate you taking the time to come in and join us tonight. I have a feeling that we'll be talking sometime in 2019 about politics on PEI. My guest next week will be Corinne Hendricken-Eldershaw as we sit down with the Alzheimer's Society of PEI to talk about Alzheimer Awareness Month on PEI. For the rest of the crew, I'm Matt Beardsley. Thanks for watching Island View on Eastlink Community TV. We will see you next Tuesday night at 7 o'clock.